This is a Christian evidence class, and my name is Dave Ibrahim. I'm from the Greater Hartford Church, also known as the Heart. I was baptized when I was 14 years old. So I was baptized in the New York City Church of Christ, and I grew up in New Jersey. But I'm happy to speak to you on why we can trust the New Testament. And like I said, if you have any questions that you have about Jesus or the Bible or the New Testament or whatever, or even outside of that, put it in the chat and I'll try to see if I can come back and answer some of your questions. But the title of the class is Confessions of a Doubter. And I don't know about you, but I've had some doubts. I'm a doubter by nature. Like, did I shut off the light? Oh, did I lock the door? Or, I'm a very much like a double checker. I don't know if you call it OCD, whatever you want to call it, but I'm a doubter by nature. But I also take this kind of doubt sometimes into my faith. And I've questioned everything. Is God real? Does God really exist? Was Jesus real? Could I trust Jesus? Could I trust the Bible? How do I know if the Bible is true? There are so many different religions out there. And, I've had all sorts of questions, even as a teenager, even as a disciple. I remember going to college. I went to Rutgers University, and I took a class called Jesus. All right. And I'm thinking, it's a class called Jesus. I'm going to learn about Jesus. That's going to be great. It was taught by a professor who was also a minister. And like I said, I'm excited to learn about Jesus. Great. And, I'm already a disciple. I'm a Christian. Great. This is going to be an awesome class. And so we're studying out the Gospels in the class. And the whole time, the professor, who's also a minister, is basically throwing doubt on everything that Jesus said in the Gospels. Oh, well, Jesus said this, but he didn't say that, and we're not sure about this. And I was like, whoa, he's basically telling the class, what I read about Jesus, I can't trust. It's not reliable. And for me, this led to more doubts. Can I trust Jesus? Is the Bible true? I want to make sure if I'm going to follow God, I want to make sure this is true. And I know that everybody has doubts or questions. Maybe you're here because you have some doubts or you have some questions. Again, you could put them in the chat if you want. I could try to get around to it. Or maybe somebody that's having doubts and questions. And I just want to say, if you're a doubter out there, it's okay. It's okay to have questions. It's okay to have doubts. And I encourage you, talk to your parent or a teen worker or a minister, someone that could help you. It's okay to have questions. It's okay to have doubts because we're human. We're people. Sometimes we need answers. And it's okay to be honest. And guess what? God is not mad. God could handle your questions. God could definitely handle your doubts. And I want to tell you that in the Bible, there's a lot of famous people that had doubts and questions. Take John the Baptist. John the Baptist is sitting in jail and he sends his disciples to ask Jesus, are you the one who is to come or should we expect somebody else? In other words, why am I here sitting in jail if you're the Messiah? This is not supposed to happen. Or if you think about doubting Thomas, Thomas said, well, you guys saw the resurrection. That's what you say, but I won't believe until I touch his wounds. And of course, what does Jesus do? Does he come and rebuke Thomas? No, he says, listen, touch my hands, touch my feet, stop doubting and believe. And so Jesus is able to handle our questions and doubts. He's able to do it. I remember sitting at the student center at my college and I'm sharing my doubts to an older Christian. And he said to me, Dave, have you ever doubted your doubts? Have you ever doubted? And it hit me. I was like, whoa, doubted my doubts. I've never doubted my doubts. Because a lot of my doubts, I had some questions, but a lot of them were emotional questions, like emotional feelings about my faith. Not necessarily questions, but emotional feelings. And he said, man, have you ever doubted your doubts? I was like, wow, that's a great question. But today, what I want to do is I want to give you some tools and some things you could hold on to that would help kind of anchor your faith. So you know why it's true. And I can't do a whole lot with the little bit of time that I have. Like I said, if you have some questions, I'll try to, answer them, in the chat. But why should we trust the Gospels? Something happened after Jesus was crucified. Well, something big happened. How do we know? Because we have the church, because we know Christianity started, because we have the New Testament. Something happened. And if you were to ask the early disciples, what caused the New Testament? What caused the church? What caused you to go out there and preach in the cities and in the streets? They would tell you and I, Jesus rose from the dead. And we say, well, how do you know that? They'd say, not because we believe, but because we saw him, physically saw him raised from the dead. You see, that's very different. When someone says, I believe something, like you and I, we could believe that George Washington was the first president of the United States, but you can't say you saw him. We're relying on what somebody else said to believe that George Washington was the first president of the United States. You didn't see him, I didn't see him. When the early Christians said they preached the resurrection of Jesus, we saw him heal. We saw him preach. We saw him rise from the dead. That's very different than us today saying we believe that. So when we read the New Testament, we got to understand that they're writing about what they saw, heard, felt, and touched. Okay? So I want to start with that. None of the New Testament Gospels start with once upon a time in a long, faraway land. They don't start like, kind of some fictional story. In fact, if you could turn to Luke 1 in verse 1, it says, and this is how he starts his gospel account. Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as if they are handed down to us from those who were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. With this in mind, since I carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I decided to write an orderly account to you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things that have been taught. What he's saying is, I went back and I investigated everything from the beginning. From who? Eyewitnesses. I want to make sure I know this. I'm not just going to talk to somebody who didn't see this stuff. Luke goes back to the eyewitnesses, and that makes it very different. So we got to understand that when we're reading the New Testament, we're talking about eyewitnesses, people who were there, not people removed 100, 200, 300 years later, people who saw Jesus, met with Jesus, ate with Jesus, and that's very different, right? And so when historians study the past, one of the things that they want to do to establish the truth is ask a question called, has it been multiply attested? In other words, if it's just one person telling a story, you might doubt that one person. But if it's two people, you might say, hey, there's some credibility here. Maybe we should trust. But what if it's three people? What if it's four people? What if it's five people? All saying the same thing about an event. What we have in the Gospels is four different people saying the same thing about Jesus. So it's multiply attested. That's how the historians check for the truth. See, one story is one thing. If we just had the Gospel of Matthew and that's all we had, we might say we doubt it. But we have Matthew's testimony, Mark's testimony, Luke's testimony, John's testimony. That's four different people, four different eyewitnesses. Obviously, we have the rest of the New Testament. We have Acts, we have Paul's letters. They're all saying the same exact thing about Jesus. So if you're a historian, right, or you're looking at this like a detective, you got to know that this has been multiply attested. Again, it's one thing for one person to say one thing about Jesus. But when you have four different people writing about, and they're saying the same thing, as a historian, you have to say there's credibility here. There's truth here. Let me look into it further. And I think we got to understand the New Testament is not one book, Matthew through Revelation. It's 27 different letters of people sharing their experience with Jesus. And guess what? The whole story fits. The core, the truth of it fits. It's not one book that somebody just decided, I'm going to write this whole thing out. It's 27 different letters, all in sync, saying the same thing. And so if you're a historian, you have to say, you know what? I got to give this some credibility. That's the first thing, the multiple attestation. Historians also look at something called the principle of embarrassment. Okay, the principle of embarrassment. What's this? Well, let me ask you a question. Have you ever told a lie to make yourself look bad? No, right? You've always told lies to make yourself look good. Never do you tell a lie to make yourself look bad. Guess what? In the New Testament, we have what's called the principle of embarrassment. In other words, people wrote things down even if it made them look bad. What do you mean by that, Dave? Well, take, for example, in Mark chapter 8. Jesus is telling the disciples, verse 31, that he's going to suffer, be rejected, and die. Okay? In verse 32, Peter pulls him aside and says, and rebukes him. Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan." Okay? So if you were Peter, right? I mean, would you want them to know that you were just called Satan by Jesus? That's an embarrassing detail. You would be ashamed for people to know that, but it's there. Jesus called you Satan. I don't know if Jesus called me Satan, that's probably not the first thing that I want people to know, right? But it's there. Why? Because the writers were concerned about the truth. They're not making this stuff up, even if it makes them look bad. Another example you think about, remember when Jesus was praying in the Garden of Gethsemane? All the disciples, what were they doing? They were sleeping. They were sleeping on their best friend before he was crucified. They couldn't stay awake. That's the principle of embarrassment. It makes them look bad. At Jesus' most crucial moment, they weren't there for him. When he goes to the cross, it notes that all the disciples fled. Again, it makes them look bad. It makes them look bad. Why are you going to put that if it makes you look bad? You want to start the church and you're already looking bad when I'm reading these New Testament letters. And you know what the big thing is? When Jesus rose from the dead, you know who the first people were to go see Jesus? It was the women. Why? Because the guys were hiding out scared that they were going to be crucified themselves if they were caught. What man would write that, yeah, the dudes were out hiding, somewhere under in a cave somewhere, but it was the women who went to go see Jesus at the tomb? What guy would make that up? It makes him look bad. You look like a coward. You look scared. Again, why is it in there? Because they were concerned with telling the truth. You see what I'm saying? They weren't trying to look good just to look good. They were concerned with the truth. And so when you read the New Testament, it passes that principle of embarrassment test. It passes the multiple attestation test. If you're a historian, you look at this and you say, and again, this is a historian looking at anything, not just the Bible, looking at anything. The principle of embarrassment, there's embarrassing detail. Oh, you know what? It's probably true because no one lies to make themselves look bad. It's probably true, right? So you got to really look at the Bible with almost a historian lens to say, you know what? There's something credible here. You know how many people who were atheists and question the Bible, they go back and they look at it and they say, this is amazing. There's a guy who wrote a book called Cold Case Christianity. For 35 years, he was an atheist. Now, he's a cold case homicide detective. In other words, his job is to solve crimes that have been closed. No one ever was able to find a conclusion to the crime. And sometimes 30 years later, he comes back to the evidence and tries to solve the problem. That was his job. He's a cold case homicide detective. He's an atheist. One day he decided to buy a Bible and look at the Gospels and investigate using his training. And he came out saying, you know what? There's something credible here. There's something believable here, because you don't make this stuff up. He's able to analyze the details in the Gospels and say, you know what, this stuff is true. How many people over the course of time have, when they come to the Bible with an open heart, journalists, detectives, historians, atheists, agnostics, doubters, when they come to the Bible with an open heart, they say, you know what, there's something here. There's something here that speaks the ring of truth. Okay, so we have multiple attestation. We have the principle of embarrassment. Last thing, because we're running out of time here, is the disciples followed Jesus even to the point of death and suffering. People lie because it gives them some sort of advantage. I think we could all agree to that, right? What advantage did the early disciples, did the apostles get from following Jesus? Did they get money? Did they get power? Did they get respect? No, none of that. They were hunted down like dogs because they were preaching Jesus had raised from the dead. Read the book of Acts. They were ridiculed. They were beaten, stoned. They were killed. One scholar reads this and looks at what the disciples did. He said this. He said, why would the disciples lie? If they lied, what was their reason? What did they get out of it? What they got out of it was misunderstanding, rejection, persecution, torture, and death for their faith. That doesn't sound that great, does it? All those that saw Jesus were willing to suffer for their faith because of what they saw. Now, you could say, well, a lot of people die for their faith. You know, think about 9/11, right? You know, these guys taking airplanes into the Twin Towers in New York City. A lot of people die for their faith. Yeah, that's true. But people don't die for what they know to be false. When those guys who took airplanes into the Twin Towers, they were acting on a belief of something that happened 1,000 years ago. They weren't there. They didn't see what happened 1,000 years ago. They're acting on belief. What's different is when the disciples died, they died knowing what was true and what was false because they were with Jesus. They saw him raised from the dead. That's what they claimed. They said, you know what? You could kill me. You could stone me. You could torture me. I'm telling you what I saw, and I'm not backing down. See, that's very different than someone who dies for their faith 1,000 years later for something they believe. Like if you and I decide to die for Jesus now, we went to some country and they killed us for our faith. We're dying for our belief in Jesus, which is good. When the disciples, the apostles died for their faith, they died for what they saw. And that is totally different. They died for what they experienced. They touched him. They saw him. They saw him preach. They saw him teach. They saw him do miracles. You know, in fact, Peter writes in 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 16. Here's what he said years later. He says, for we did not follow cleverly devised stories when we told you about the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ in power. He says, we were eyewitnesses of his testimony. 2 Peter 1:16. 1 John 1:1 starts, that which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, we've touched with our hands. This is what we're telling you. We're proclaiming to you Jesus. And I read to you Luke 1:1, how he says, I investigated everything from the beginning. See, we could put our trust in Jesus. You could put we put our faith in so many things, right, in life. You think about it. We put our faith in things that we are lesser. For example, every time you go to McDonald's and you order the quarter pounder or the double Whopper or whatever you order, you live by faith. Well, what do you mean by that? I live by faith. How do you know that the person has not stuck some poison in your burger? You live by faith, right? You know, every time you get into an airplane, maybe you've been in an airplane, how do you know that the pilot is not getting behind that cockpit drunk or high? You live by faith. You're living by faith. Or if you walk into a building somewhere, how do you know that that ceiling is not going to collapse? You live by faith because you assume that the contractors and the people that built this thing were licensed, had the rights to build this thing, were qualified to build. We put our faith in everything. At a stoplight, you assume that the other person's going to stop or go. Or when it's green, you assume when you drive that everyone else is going to stop. We live by faith in so many things. Guess what? Jesus is more trustworthy than Mickey D's. Jesus is more trustworthy than the pilot flying your plane. Jesus is a lot more trustworthy. And if you're going to live by faith in all these other things, you can't tell me that it's hard to live by faith in Jesus. I love this in John chapter 8, verse 31 and 32. Jesus says, if you hold to my teaching, then you're really my disciples. He says, then you'll know the truth. If I want to know if this is true, Jesus says, start applying this to your life. Start living it. You see, it's easy. It's kind of like a hypothesis in your science class. You make an educated guess. That's your hypothesis. Then you investigate and see if your hypothesis is true. Jesus says, go ahead, test me, try me. Try me. You want to know if this is true? Apply this to your life, and you're going to see the benefits of all that, what I'm saying. It's going to be true. Why am I still a Christian today? Because everything that Jesus says works. Everything that Jesus says makes sense. Anytime that I've ever felt regret in my life has been because I've decided not to put Jesus' words into practice. Every regret, every amount of guilt, every amount of shame has because I've decided, hey, I didn't want to follow God in this moment. I guarantee you, if you're someone who's looking for purpose and meaning and peace and a mission, if you decide to put your trust in Jesus, he won't let you down. I'm here, years later after I became a Christian at 14 years old, and I'm still here because I trust Jesus. Because there's nothing he's ever said that's been false. People will let you down. You will let yourself down. Your loved ones may let you down. But Jesus has never let me down. That's why I'm still here today. I know it's true. Not because of what I know in my head. It's what I know in my heart. Because I've decided to apply his teaching to my life. And I want to challenge you guys. If you're out there and you've not decided to try this, I want to challenge you to try it. Because you'll only know if it's true if you give it all your heart and apply it to your life. You'll only know. If you have questions and doubts, you're not a disciple, I challenge you to decide to take a month, 2 months, 3 months and decide, I'm going to follow Jesus with all my heart. I dare you to do it. And if you're a disciple and you're struggling with questions and doubts, that's okay. Be honest, be open. Talk about those things because that's when we get answers. I have, you see all these books here? All these books are oftentimes because I've had questions. But I research and I look for the answers, and it's been, if anything, the more I've investigated Christianity, the more it's made my faith stronger, not less, not weak, stronger. The more I've looked into the reasons for the faith, the more my faith has grown. So I say, if you have questions, go ahead and investigate, seek the answers, seek the truth. Because Jesus says the truth will set you free. So we have about a minute left. Please type in some questions in the chat. I'd love to answer some of those questions. And if it doesn't have to be about the New Testament. What's a good book to some? I recommended a book called Cold Case Christianity, written by a cold case homicide detective. There's a lot of great books. Evidence That Demands a Verdict by McDowell. Evidence That Demands a Verdict by McDowell. That's a thick book. I mean, there are just so many. The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel could be a good one. That's a classic. I mean, there's so many out there. There's tons and tons of information. Thank you, Noah, for the class. I thank you that you enjoyed it. Appreciate it. Any other questions?